The heat lay over Ashwell like a hand pressed flat, and it was in that heat, on the lane below Renfield's north gate, that a duke who had been home 11 days learned there was a debt in the parish no one had told him he owed. He did not yet know the boy's name when he reined the gelding hard to keep from riding him down, and he would remember, afterward, that the child had not flinched, had only planted his bare feet wider in the dust as if the horse were a matter to be weighed, and found wanting. Gideon Ashcombe, 6th Duke of Renfield, 3 months in the title, and 11 days off the packet from the peninsula, sat his horse a moment with his heart going harder than the near miss warranted, and looked down at a boy of perhaps 7 years in a coat cut for a man twice his size, and did what men of his rank did without thinking, which was to reach for his purse. He had not yet learned, that morning, that the coin he meant kindly would come back to him before the dust of it settled, and that its return would matter more than anything he did that year in Parliament or on the estate books. He flipped the coin, an easy underhand toss, the kind he had given to 100 boys on 100 roads without a second thought. The boy caught it clean, out of the air, the catch of someone who had gone hungry enough to trust his hands more than his belly. He turned it once between finger and thumb, found the crest stamped into the silver, and went very still. Then he threw it back. He did not fumble the throw or soften it in courtesy. He put it back into the Duke's hand with the flat, deliberate motion of a man closing an account, and said, in a voice too steady for his years, "My mother says we don't take yours." Gideon looked at the coin lying in his own palm as though it had been handed back scalded. "Whose, then, will you take?" he asked, and the question came out lighter than he felt it. The boy considered this with the gravity of a magistrate weighing a plea. "Honest ones," he said finally, and was gone down the lane before the Duke could ask what dishonesty a coin of his could carry, running with the loose-limbed speed of a child who had somewhere better to be, or nowhere at all, which came to the same thing at that age. Corporal Nathaniel Pike, who had followed his colonel out of 2 campaigns and into a household he privately considered far more dangerous, brought his own horse alongside and said nothing for the length of the lane, which was, from Pike, its own kind of commentary. "You knew him," Gideon said. "It was not a question, quite, everyone in Ashwell knows the Winter boy," Pike said. "And the Winter boy's mother, though she'd rather you didn't. She takes in mending. Fine hand with figures, too, they say, though there's no call for a widow to keep accounts, unless she means to keep someone honest by them." Gideon turned the coin over once more before he put it away, and something in him, some old soldier's instinct for a position not yet mapped, told him this was ground he would be crossing again. He was 3 weeks from Michaelmas, and the accounting his father's will demanded of him, a full and independent audit, rendered to the family's trustee within the year of his taking the title, or the estate would pass into administration until an heir could be found worth trusting with it, a clause his father had written, Pike said, after watching too many young men come into money and lose their heads along with it. 3 weeks was not long. Gideon did not yet know how much of that clock belonged to a boy who would not take his coin. He would remember, later, that he had laughed once, softly, at the boy's retreating back, and that it was the first time he had laughed at all since coming home to a house with his father's chair still turned toward the window his father used to watch the drive from, waiting for a son who had, in the end, come home too late to be watched for. Grief did not announce itself in him with weeping. It sat in his shoulders and made his voice quieter than it used to be, and made him ride out alone in the mornings before the house woke, because a house full of servants who had loved his father better than they yet knew him was its own kind of grief to carry. The cottage stood at the fen edge where Renfield's land gave way to common ground, and Gideon told himself, riding out 3 days later with the boy's coat under his arm, a coat too fine for a widow's son, cast off from the rag and bone man's cart, mended so carefully at the collar that the stitches themselves seemed to be arguing a case. That he came only to return what the child had left snagged on the gate paling. He knew, even as he told himself this, that it was not entirely true. The woman who opened the door was not what the village gossip had prepared him for. She was neither bent by hardship nor softened by appeal for it. She stood in the doorway, with her sleeves turned back to the elbow and flower to the wrist, and she looked at him the way, he thought, a merchant looks at a bill presented twice. "Your Grace," she said, and there was no curtsy in it, only the flat courtesy owed a stranger who has not yet proven himself worth more. "I've brought the boy's coat," Gideon said, and held it out, and felt absurdly like a supplicant. Elsa Winter took the coat, examined the collar's mending with the swift, assessing pass of someone checking another's sums, and set it on the chair inside without inviting him to follow it. "He'll have grown out of it by Christmas regardless," she said. "There's no debt in a coat, Your Grace, if that's what you've come to settle." "I came about the coin," Gideon said. "Your son returned it." "My son does as he's told. He said you don't take mine." Something crossed her face then, quick as a bird through a window, gone before he could read it fully, and he had, in the war, learned to read faces the way other men read letters, because a man's face was often the only warning you got before he moved. "We don't take charity, Your Grace," she said. "There's a difference, though I don't expect the distinction troubles you much, coming from where you sit. It troubles me enough that I rode out to ask about it." Hetty Combs, who had been folding linen at the far table and had said nothing so far beyond a sniff that carried its own opinion, spoke now without looking up. "He rode out because he's curious, Elsa, same as any man who's been told no by somebody who owed him a yes." "Nobody owes His Grace anything," Elsa said. "That's rather the trouble," Gideon said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it as something other than politeness. "I understand you keep accounts, for the shops, my steward says, for those honest enough to pay a fair wage for it. I don't keep books for men who'd rather I didn't look too closely at their columns. I have linens at the manor in worse disorder than my father left the tenantry rolls," Gideon said. "I'll pay you the going rate, and you may look as closely as you like." She studied him a long moment, weighing, he understood later, not the offer but the man making it, whether this was charity dressed as a wage, the oldest trick in the parish's long acquaintance with the great house. "Wednesdays," she said at last, "I won't come to the manor, and I won't take a carriage sent for me. I walk, or I don't come at all." Wednesdays, Gideon agreed, and did not ask why a woman who mended sheets for a living would refuse a carriage, though he noted it the way he had once noted the position of an enemy picket, filed for later use. Hetty saw him to the gate, which he had not expected, and looked up at him with the particular bluntness of a woman who had buried a husband, 2 brothers, and most of her patience for gentlemen. "You'll want to know about Samuel Winter before you go asking any more of her," she said. "Everyone in this village knows something of him but her, and she's the only one with the right to speak it. So I'll say only this much and no more. He kept the books for your father's steward, once a bailiff's son with a gift for figures nobody trained into him. It was simply there, the way some men are born with a good ear for music. He was dismissed in disgrace 3 years back over money that went missing from the estate, and he was dead within the 12-month, and whether the disgrace killed him or the fever that took him after, nobody in Ashwell has ever agreed, though we've argued it over enough pints to fill the mill pond twice. And she believes he was innocent. She believes what a wife believes, Your Grace, which is not proof, whatever else it is." Gideon rode back toward the manor with the fenlarks going up ahead of his horse and a single fact settling into him like a stone dropped into still water: that his father, or his father's steward, had ruined a man 3 years before he had come home to inherit either of their mistakes. Aldrich Vane had managed the Renfield accounts for 11 years, first under the old Duke and now, provisionally, under the new one, and he wore his authority the way he wore his linen, immaculately, without a crease to suggest strain. He found Gideon in the estate office 2 mornings later, bent over rolls of tenant rents that meant less to him, still, than a company muster ever had. And he set a cup of chocolate at his elbow with the soft solicitude of a man who had learned that gentleness disarmed better than argument. "You rode out to the Fen cottages again," Vane said. "Not quite a question. I understand you've engaged the winter woman for the household linens. Is there some objection?" "None whatsoever, Your Grace. Only a caution, offered as a cousin might offer it, though I know my claim to the word is thin." Vane's smile did not change, which was, Gideon would come to learn, the most reliable thing about it. The winter business was a sad affair, and old wounds in a small parish fester worse for being reopened. "I'd counsel you to let it lie. There's little to be gained in digging up a dead man's debts, and a great deal of grief to be found there instead." "I hadn't meant to dig anywhere. I meant only to have my linens mended." "Of course," Vane said, and touched, as he often did when a conversation had reached its edge, the small mourning pin at his cravat, gold worked round a lock of pale hair, a habit so unconscious Gideon would not think to remark it until it meant everything. "McElmus is 3 weeks off, Your Grace, and Sir Rowland Hale is a punctual man where your father's will is concerned. I'd rather your attention on the rent rolls than on old parish sorrows, if it's all the same to you." It was, on its face, reasonable counsel, and Gideon told himself so for the length of an afternoon, though something in the smoothness of it sat wrong with him the way a 2-level floor sits wrong with a soldier's feet. Below in the servants' hall, the household had already made its own arrangements about the matter, as households will. The scullery maid had it from the groom that his Grace had ridden to the winter cottage twice in a week. The groom had it from Pike, who denied saying any such thing and was therefore believed absolutely, and Mrs. Fenn, the housekeeper, presiding over the whole exchange with the weary authority of a woman who had run this house through 3 deaths and a war. Allowed only that the linens had wanted mending for a 12-month, and it was no one's affair whose hands did it. "A shilling says he marries money before Christmas regardless," said one footman. "A shilling says he doesn't marry at all, not with that look on him," said another. And Mrs. Fenn confiscated both shillings on the grounds that gambling on a grieving man's heart was beneath the house, and kept the coins in a jar she never did return. Elsa came on the Wednesday as promised, walked the 2 miles rather than ride, and set herself to the linen closet with the brisk efficiency of a woman who resented being noticed doing anything less than well. It was there, waiting for a fresh basket, that she passed the open door of the estate office and saw, laid out on Vane's desk in the morning light, the current rent roll beside an older ledger she recognized without wanting to, recognized by the hand in the margins, which was not Vane's careful copperplate, but a smaller, quicker script she had watched form letters at a kitchen table a lifetime ago. She did not go in. She had learned, in 3 years of widowhood, precisely how much curiosity a woman in her position could afford, and the answer was none at all, not openly. But she noted, the way Samuel had taught her to note a column that would not balance, that the figure for the home farm's autumn rent in the old book read differently from the figure copied into the new one, a 7 made over into what might, at a careless glance, be taken for a 1. She filed it away, as one files away a suspicion too small yet to spend, and went back to her mending, and said nothing to anyone, though her hands, sorting linen, were not quite steady for the better part of an hour. By the fourth Wednesday, the household had stopped pretending surprise when the Duke found some reason to be in whichever room Elsa Winter was working, and she had stopped pretending she did not notice him arranging it. He came to the linen room with a lapful of estate correspondence he claimed needed sorting, though Mrs. Fenn could have sorted it blindfolded in half the time, and sat on the low stool by the window while Elsa turned him and he pretended to read. "You caught an error in the household accounts last week," he said. "Mrs. Fenn's cook has been buying candles at a price no honest chandler charges. I only looked because the numbers didn't sit right, the way a hem doesn't sit right when the seam's been rushed. You have a gift for it." "I had a husband for it," she said, and did not soften the correction, though her needle did not pause either, which he had come to understand was how she managed most of her grief, by keeping her hands too busy to follow it. "He taught me to read a column the way some men are taught to read weather. You look at the sky long enough with someone who knows it, and you start to see the storm before it's arrived. Will you tell me about him?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she meant to refuse outright, and he found he minded that more than he expected to. "There is a thing about my husband I have not told you, Your Grace," she said finally, "and I am not ready to lay it before you. Not yet. When I am, you will hear all of it, and you may do what you like with it then. Until that day, I would ask you not to ask again. That's a hard bargain. It's the only one I have to offer." He accepted it the way he had learned, in the army, to accept a superior officer's silence on a matter not yet ripe for orders, not gladly, but with the discipline of a man who understood that some ground could not be taken by pushing. Toby came that afternoon to walk his mother home, and stood in the doorway assessing the Duke with the same flat suspicion he had shown the coin, until Gideon, without quite planning it, asked him what a soldier's coat looked like from the inside, and whether he thought a Duke's boots were any use for climbing the fen bank, and by the end of it the boy had demonstrated, at some length and with considerable authority, exactly how a boy of 7 ought to climb a fen bank, and Gideon had laughed, not the polite exhalation he had performed for callers since coming home, but a real, startled laugh that surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise Elsa, who looked up from her folding as though she had heard a door open somewhere in the house she had thought permanently shut. "That's the first time I've heard that sound since you took the title," she said, before she seemed to have decided whether to say it at all. "Is it so remarkable? It's the first sign I've had that there's a man under the mourning, Your Grace, rather than merely a duke wearing it." He carried that sentence home with him more carefully than he carried the correspondence he had pretended to need sorted, and lay awake with it longer than he would have admitted to Pike, who asked only once at breakfast whether His Grace meant to keep riding out on Wednesdays that weren't Wednesdays, and was told, with a dignity Pike found extremely funny, that a duke could ride where he pleased. It was Vane who broke the quiet, and he did it gently, which was always his way, arriving in the estate office on a morning 10 days from Michaelmas with a folder held against his chest the way a man carries bad news he has rehearsed delivering kindly. "I had hoped not to bring this to you," he said, and set the folder on the desk with the reluctant care of a man performing a duty he found distasteful, though his hands, Gideon would remember later, had not trembled at all. "Your father kept a private record of the winter dismissal. I have read it only because your solicitor asked me to prepare the Michaelmas papers, and I could not, in conscience, leave you ignorant of what it says." Inside was a confession, or what purported to be one, Samuel Winter's own hand, or a passable forgery of it, admitting to the diversion of rent monies over 2 years, admitting shame, admitting he had done it to clear debts of his own making. Gideon read it twice and felt something in his chest go cold and careful. the way it used to go before an engagement he had not chosen the ground for. You believe this is genuine. I have no reason to think otherwise, Your Grace, and every reason to wish it were not so, given how attached you've become to the family. Vane let that land, soft as a blade laid flat against the skin before it turns. There is a further matter, and I raise it only because I would rather you hear it from me than from Sir Rowland at the audit. The Winter Woman has been seen copying figures from the household books into a private hand of her own. Mrs. Fenn found pages of it in the linen room, tucked beneath a basket, in a script that matches, disturbingly, both her late husband's confession and certain irregularities I have only lately begun to trace in the rent accounts. I do not say what it means. I say only that an honest woman keeping a false accounting in her own hand, in a house not her own, is not nothing, and that I would be failing my duty to your father's memory if I did not lay it before you plainly. It was, Gideon understood even as it struck him, a masterwork of half-truth, every fact in it real, arranged to point in exactly the wrong direction, the way a compass needle can be made to lie true to the metal beside it, rather than to the north. But he did not know that yet, not with certainty, and doubt, once seated, does not wait politely for proof before it makes itself comfortable. I want to see the household books she's been keeping, he said. Of course, though I would ask, Your Grace, that until the matter is resolved, you consider whether it is wise to continue her employment here. Sir Rowland will want the accounts unclouded by any question of impropriety when he arrives, and a woman with a forger's husband and a forger's own hand at your linen closet is precisely the kind of question he will ask. Gideon did not answer him at once, and Vane, reading the silence correctly as the crack he had been widening for a fortnight, allowed himself the smallest satisfaction of touching his cravat pin once, and let himself out. That night Gideon sat alone in his father's study, with the confession spread before him, and the fire burned low, and told himself he was weighing evidence, and knew, somewhere beneath the telling, that he was only delaying a wound he did not want to give. He went to the cottage the next morning without sending word, which Elsa read correctly, the moment she opened the door, as the visit of a man who had come to accuse rather than call. You've heard something, she said, before he had spoken a word. I've seen your husband's confession. There is no confession. My husband confessed to nothing, because there was nothing in him to confess. I've also seen pages in your hand, copied from the household ledgers. Her face did not change, but her hands, folding a cloth that did not need folding, went very still, the stillness he had learned, in the war and since, to read as a man taking a blow without letting it show. I kept those pages because I did not trust what I was seeing, she said, not because I meant to sell it or forge it or ruin anyone with it. I have spent 3 years watching this house's name attached to my husband's disgrace, Your Grace, and I will not apologize for wanting proof of my own before I trust a single word your steward offers you. Then give it to me. Not yet. Elsa, it was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed between them with more weight than either of them expected. I am asking you to trust me. You are asking me to hand over the only thing that has kept my son fed and clothed on the strength of my silence to a man I have known 10 weeks, on the word of a duke whose own steward has just handed him a confession, forged well enough to fool him. She set the cloth down at last, squared it corner to corner on the table with a precision that was its own kind of fury. You'll forgive me if I don't consider that a fair exchange. I'm not asking for an exchange. I'm asking because I want to help you. I have had one man in this parish offer to help me, Your Grace, and it was Mr. Vane's clerk, not a fortnight past, with a purse and a promise that the trouble would end the day I left the county and never spoke my husband's name again. That stopped him cold. Someone offered you money to leave. £20 and a character reference for wherever I chose to go, so long as it was far enough that I stopped asking why a 7 in an old ledger had become a 1 in a new one. She had not meant to say that last part. He could see it cross her face the instant it left her. A door opened a crack too far, but she did not retreat from it. I sent him away with the purse still in his pocket, because I would rather starve honest than eat what that money would have cost me. My husband died believing his name was worth more than his comfort. I don't intend to spend what's left of it more cheaply than he did. £20 was, Gideon knew with the plain arithmetic of a man newly responsible for an estate's books, a great deal of money to a woman who walked 2 miles rather than accept a carriage, and the refusal of it, offered so flatly, without appeal for his admiration, struck him harder than any plea could have. He left the cottage that day without the pages he had come for, and without an answer to the question eating at him, and rode home turning over the plain fact of a bribe offered by someone close enough to Vane's business to know exactly what silence was worth buying. The dismissal, when it came, was Vane's doing dressed in Mrs. Fenn's reluctant hand, a note sent to the cottage informing Mrs. Winter that her services at the manor were no longer required until certain questions regarding the household accounts had been resolved to the trustees' satisfaction, and it was followed within 2 days by a parish officer at the cottage door with a warrant to search for stolen property and a magistrate's clerk trailing behind him looking apologetic about the whole business. Toby, sent out to fetch water, came back to find a stranger's hands going through his mother's sewing box and did the only thing a boy of 7 with a soldier's instincts and no soldier's restraint could do, which was to plant himself in the doorway and refuse to move until Hetty Combs came at a run with her apron still on and her voice loud enough to carry to the millpond. "You'll not take that child anywhere," she told the clerk, "not while there's breath in me to say otherwise, and I'll say it to Sir Rowland Hale himself if you make me walk to Renfield to do it." The officers found nothing, because Elsa had moved the account book 3 days before to a place even Hetty did not know, sewn into the lining of a shawl that had been her mother's, worn every day since, hidden precisely because it was too plain a thing to search. But the search itself did its damage. By evening the whole parish had heard that the Winter widow was under suspicion of theft, and the shopkeepers who had trusted her with their books for 2 years sent word, one by one, apologetic and firm, that they would not need her services further. Gideon heard of the search an hour after it happened and rode for the cottage in a fury he had not felt since his last engagement, and found the door shut against him, not locked, but shut, which Elsa had never done before. "I did not order this," he said through the wood. "I know you didn't," she said, and her voice, muffled, had none of its usual iron in it, which frightened him more than anger would have. "That is precisely the trouble, Your Grace. You didn't order it, and you didn't stop it, and I am beginning to understand that in this house those amount to the same thing." He stood a long moment with his hand flat against her door, the way he might once have stood against a wall, waiting for an order that did not come, and then he went, because there was nothing else to be done standing in a lane, and because some part of him, raw and ashamed, knew she was not entirely wrong. That night, in the estate office, going through his father's private correspondence for the 3rd time in search of anything that might explain the confession's wrongness, he found a letter he had overlooked twice before. Tucked behind a ledger where it had no business being, a letter from his brother Edmund, 3 years dead of a fever in Lisbon before Gideon had ever come home to bury either of them, written to their father the winter before Samuel Winter's dismissal. It said little directly, the caution of a young man writing of a suspicion he could not yet prove, but it said enough that Edmund had noticed. On his last visit home, a discrepancy between the home farm's roles and the tenants' own reckoning of what they'd paid, and that he intended to speak to Vane about it before he sailed again, and that if anything should come of it before his return, their father was to trust Samuel Winter's figures over anyone else's, for the bailiff's son had the steadiest hand with a column of any man on the estate. Edmund had never come home to finish the thought. Gideon sat with the letter a long time, the fire gone to embers, and understood that his own brother had seen this 3 years before he had, and died before he could say it plainly, and that the question eating him now was not whether Elsa Winter had told him the truth, but whether he had come to it too late to matter. He went to her at first light, the letter in his coat, and did not wait to be let in before he began speaking through the door, which cracked open before he had finished the second sentence. "My brother suspected Vane before he died," he said. "I have his letter. I should have believed you a week ago, and I am asking you now, not as a duke to a widow, but as one honest column asking another to be checked against it. Will you show me what Samuel found?" She studied him the way she had studied the coat collar on the first day, assessing the stitching before she trusted the seam, and then she went to the shawl on its peg and drew the small oxblood book from its lining, with hands that were, for the first time since he had known her, not quite steady. He wrote it in the cipher his father, the seed merchant, used. For tallying stock nobody else was meant to read, she said, laying the book open on the table. "I can read some of it. Not all. He meant to teach me the rest, and then there was no more time." Together, in the gray light, they matched the small, cramped marginal figures against the copy of the current rent roll Gideon had brought from the estate office without Vane's knowledge. And where Samuel's hand recorded a 7 for the home farm's autumn rent 3 years running, the household's current ledger recorded a 1. The loop of the 7's crossbar shaved away so neatly it might have passed for careless copying rather than what it plainly was, once you knew to look, a theft compounding itself, year on year, dressed up as arithmetic. "This is not enough on its own," Gideon said, though he could feel his own certainty hardening as he said it. A dead man's private cipher, matched by a widow with reason to want it true. Vane will call it exactly what he called your other pages. Then we need someone who wrote the false figures in his own hand and can be made to say so before witnesses. "Croft," Gideon said. Simon Croft kept the estate's daybooks under Vane's direction, a nervous, cuff-fidgeting young man who had come to Renfield with nothing and seemed permanently braced for it to be taken from him again, and Gideon had watched him twice now flinch at Vane's voice in a way that spoke less of respect than of a man keeping an old bargain he had long since stopped wanting. It took Pike 2 days of patient, unthreatening conversation over pints at the Ashwell public house to learn that Croft had a widowed mother in Norwich he sent half his wages to, and a debt of his own from before he came to Renfield that Vane had, 4 years past, quietly settled, a kindness Croft had never stopped paying for. Sir Rowland Hale, informed by private letter of what the Duke had found, agreed to move nothing of his Michaelmas schedule, which was, he wrote back dryly, the whole use of a punctual man. Let the guilty believe the clock ran as it always had, and it would catch them precisely on time. Vane, for his part, felt the ground shift beneath him only once that week. On the evening he came upon Gideon and Elsa Winter walking the drive together in open daylight, unhurried, her hand for a moment resting on his sleeve as she made some point about a column of figures, and understood, watching them, that whatever he had meant to finish before quarter day was no longer running on his clock alone. He touched his cravat pin twice that evening, which Mrs. Fenn, who missed very little, remarked to no one in particular, was the first time she had ever seen Mr. Vane's hands unsteady over anything at all. Michaelmas came in with a hard, clean rain that broke the summer's heat at last, and the great hall at Renfield filled by mid-morning, with tenants come to render their rents and hear the trustees' audit read, a crowd larger than usual because word had traveled, as word does in small parishes, that something more than arithmetic was to be settled that day. Sir Rowland Hale sat at the long table with the estate's books before him, precise and grey and entirely unmoved by the murmuring, and Lady Priscilla Thorne sat near the window in the pale blue reserved for young women expecting an announcement, though she had begun, in the last fortnight, to look less like a bride awaiting good news than a woman calculating an exit. Gideon stood, and the hall went quiet the way a room does when it senses the day's true business is about to begin. Before Sir Rowland reads the accounts, he said, "There is a matter concerning the estate's rolls for the past 3 years that I must lay before this house, because it touches the honor of a man who cannot speak for himself, and a family who has waited 3 years to hear him spoken for." He set Samuel Winter's ledger on the table beside the current rent roll and held both to the tall window's light so that the hall could see, plainly, the 7 shaved into a 1, year upon year, in a hand that was not Samuel's. "This is my husband's private accounting," Elsa said, coming forward though no one had summoned her, her voice steady in a way that cost her everything to make sound easy. "He kept it because he found what I am showing you today, and he was dismissed and disgraced and died believing no one would ever look closely enough to see it." Vane rose, smooth as ever, already reaching for the register of grief and outrage that had served him a decade. A widow's grief does great credit to her loyalty, but grief is not proof, and a private cipher matched by the very woman who benefits from its reading is worth exactly what any interested testimony is worth. "Then let us ask someone with nothing to gain," Gideon said, and turned to where Simon Croft stood pressed against the wall, cuff already worried thin between his fingers. "Mr. Croft, who told you to change the 7 to a 1 in the home farm's rolls, 3 autumns running?" The hall's silence took on a different weight, the silence of a great many people leaning in without moving. Croft opened his mouth twice and closed it, and looked once, quick and helpless, at Vane, who did not look back at him, which Gideon understood, watching, to be its own kind of answer, a man cutting loose the weight that had begun to sink him. "Mr. Vane," Croft said at last, so quiet Sir Rowland had to ask him to repeat it, and then, louder, with something that sounded almost like relief at finally setting the words down. "Mr. Vane told me. 4 years ago he paid a debt for me I could never have cleared on my own, and every autumn since he's come to my desk himself with the figure already changed, and told me only to copy it clean." Sir Rowland produced then, from among his own papers, a letter Pike had found not 2 days before, pressed into the spine of an old game ledger in Vane's own desk, unsigned but unmistakably his hand, instructing Croft in terms too plain to argue with exactly which figures wanted altering and by how much, and had it read aloud into a hall gone so still the rain on the windows sounded like applause. Vane did not deny it. He stood very straight, the composure that had carried him 11 years not quite deserting him even now, though his hand went, one last time, to the small mourning pin at his cravat. "My mother wore this for a husband who left her nothing but debts and a name too proud to sell," he said, "to no one and everyone. And I swore, burying her, that I would never again be the poor cousin standing at the edge of another family's table, grateful for scraps of a fortune I helped to keep whole. Samuel Winter was a bailiff's son, the old Duke loved better than he ever loved me, and I could not forgive either of them for it, and I have been making them pay for it, in small sums, for 11 years. It was not an excuse." He did not offer it as one, and the hall, hearing it, felt the peculiar vertigo of hating a man and pitying him in the same breath. Gideon let the silence hold before he spoke again. "You will leave England within the month, on an allowance sufficient to keep you from want, and insufficient to keep you in this parish's memory," he said. "There will be no prosecution, no trial, no public accounting beyond what has been read here today. Not for your sake, Miss Vane, for hers, and for the boys, who have paid enough already for other men's ledgers, and would pay more still sitting through a courtroom built to relitigate a grief that is, as of today, closed." The wedding, when it came, was small enough that Hetty Combs complained loudly there had not been time to make a proper cake of it, though she wept through the whole brief ceremony regardless, and blew her nose on a handkerchief 3 sizes too fine for the purpose. It took place in early spring, in the little stone church at Ashwell rather than the grander chapel at Renfield, because Elsa had asked for that, plainly, and Gideon had learned by then that when she asked for a thing plainly, it was worth more than anything he could have offered unasked. He had proposed to her in the garden behind the cottage on a still evening in late autumn, after the last of the estate's business was settled, after Samuel Winter's name had been formally cleared before the parish, and a small stone set at the churchyard, reading only honest, which Elsa had chosen herself and would explain to no one. And after there was nothing left between them that either owed the other. "I am not asking because of anything I can give you," he said, "and I want you to understand that before you answer, because I know how it must look. A duke and a widow he first met over a returned coin. I am asking because I cannot walk this garden without wanting you in it, and because you were the first person in 3 years to make me laugh, and because I would rather be told no by you honestly than yes by anyone else, for reasons that have nothing to do with wanting me. Marry me, because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take." A wren was singing somewhere in the hedge, the same thread of song that had run under half their Wednesdays, without either of them remarking it aloud until now. "You once told me you'd have to find a coin that wasn't yours to give," she said. "I remember. This isn't a coin, Your Grace." "No," he said. "It was never mine to keep, this whole year of it. I only borrowed the courage to offer it from watching you refuse everything false, so I'd know the true thing when it came." She did not answer him at once, which by then he had learned to wait out without fear, and when she did answer, it was with her hand against his sleeve exactly as it had rested there, the evening Vane had watched them on the drive. And one word, plain as any figure she had ever taught it in a column, which was enough. The ledger of that year settled itself out gently, the way a good account does once the false entries are struck through. Hetty took a cottage of her own nearer the manor, on wages she called extortionate, and everyone else called overdue, and made herself indispensable to a nursery that did not yet exist, but which she assured the household would want minding within the 12-month. Simon Croft was found a clerking post in a counting house 2 counties distant, on Sir Roland's recommendation and Elsa's quiet insistence that a man who confessed at cost should not be made to pay for it twice, and he wrote once a year, faithfully, a letter of thanks Elsa kept in the same drawer as her husband's ledger, closed accounts both. Lady Priscilla Thorne, released from an engagement she had never truly wanted, took herself off to her aunt's house in Bath and wrote, within the year, of an attachment to a plain, cheerful sea captain her family considered beneath her, and she considered the first honest offer she had ever received, which Elsa, reading the letter aloud to Gideon by the fire, allowed was proof that even a redeemed rival could find her own quiet victory. Aldrich Vane sailed for the continent in November and wrote once a year thereafter, brief, correct letters that were never answered and never quite thrown away, kept instead in the bottom of a drawer the way one keeps the record of a debt fully paid, closed but not forgotten. Nearly a year to the day after a coin had been thrown and thrown back, Gideon rode the lane below the north gate again, Toby beside him now on a pony too gentle to need much watching, in a coat that fit him, and had never known a rag and bone cart, and they came upon a boy from the next parish, sitting in the ditch, mending a broken cart wheel, with more determination than skill. Gideon reined in, remembering, and reached for his purse from old habit, and Toby, laughing, reached for his own small one first and beat him to it, flipping a coin down into the boy's waiting hand with the easy, unhesitating toss of someone who had never once been made to feel small for taking what was honestly offered. "We'll take it now," Toby called back over his shoulder to his stepfather, grinning, nudging the pony forward into the spring light. "Mother says it's yours to give this time, and it's mine to give too, if I've earned the right to say so." Somewhere in the hedge the wren was singing, the same thread it had carried all that long year, and Gideon, riding on beside the boy who had once refused him everything and now offered him nearly as much in return, thought that a debt honestly paid sounds, in the end very much like that. If this story warmed you, if some part of you has ever stood very straight in a doorway and refused what was offered because you knew, better than anyone, the difference between charity and its true coin, then stay a while longer by this fire with me. There's a chair kept, a kettle on, and no hurry at all to leave it. Tell me, if you would, which line stayed with you longest, the boy's refusal, or the Duke's return to it. And if you'd like more evenings like this one, let this hearth keep a place for you too. It costs nothing but a moment to stay close, and I would be glad of the company. Sleep well tonight, and be a little more generous tomorrow with the honest ones who never asked you for a thing.